Developed, developing. You've probably heard these words thrown around all the time to describe different countries. But what do they really mean? What's the actual story behind these labels? Well, today we're going to dig into it, looking at what truly separates these two worlds. So let's get started. So what's the real story here? I mean, yeah, you've got organizations like the United Nations looking at economic stats and standards of living to put countries into one of two boxes. But what does that actually mean for the people who live there? How different is daily life? And what does it even take for a country to move from one category to the other? That's really the big question we're tackling today. All right, so to really get a handle on this whole divide, we've got to start with the basics, the definitions. What exactly does it mean when we call a country developing? Let's break it down. Okay, so a developing country is basically a nation that's still in the earlier stages of building up its industry. But, and this is super important, it's not just about factories and smokestacks. This has some really serious real-world consequences for people. Things like lower incomes, a tougher job market, and unfortunately, even higher birth and death rates. And a picture like this really captures that energy, doesn't it? You see these bustling streets, and it's a great visual for an economy that's often powered by the service sector, person-to-person businesses, instead of huge industrial factories. Think of places like India, Kenya, or Colombia. They're often pointed to as prime examples of this kind of economic dynamic. Now, let's look at the other side of the coin. A developed country is one that's already got that advanced economy, one that's built on a strong industrial and technological foundation. And all that economic power, it translates directly into real benefits for the people living there. We're talking a high GDP, a really high standard of living, and even strong social safety nets.
And this right here, this is basically the engine room of a developed economy. The main source of money isn't the service sector, it's the industrial sector. We're talking about the economic heavyweights, right? Countries like the United States, Germany, and Japan. The whole economic foundation is just completely different.
Okay. So we've got the definitions down. Now for the fun part. Let's put these two types of countries head to head and really compare the key differences, from what daily life is like to what makes their economies tick. First up, let's talk about something super personal, quality of life. And the contrast is pretty stark. In developing countries, living conditions can be pretty tough, which means a lower standard of living overall. Meanwhile, in developed nations, you've got these strong economies that can support much better living conditions and a higher quality of life pretty much across the board. Next, let's get to the real heart of the matter, their economic engines. On one side, you have that service-based economy, which can often, unfortunately, lead to a wider gap between the rich and the poor. On the other side, you've got an industrial powerhouse, which generally tends to have lower income inequality. Now, of course, no system is perfect, but it's a major, major difference. And look, these economic differences create a huge ripple effect into things like health and opportunity. It's a tough reality, but developing countries often face lower life expectancies and higher rates of unemployment and poverty. Developed countries, they generally see the opposite. People live longer and there's less unemployment and poverty. So you see, these aren't just a bunch of boring economic labels. They literally shape the course of everyday life for billions of people. So all of this leads to the biggest question of all, right? How does a country actually make that huge leap? What's the secret sauce, the engine of growth that can transform a developing nation into a developed one? Well, it turns out there are a few key ingredients.
It really boils down to four key things. First, you've got your natural resources. The raw materials a country just happens to have. But those resources are useless without human resources, skilled people who know what to do with them. Then those people need capital resources. We're talking tools, machinery, and infrastructure to actually build things. And finally, the real game changer, technology. That's the know-how to bring it all together and create a powerful, modern economy.
And this is such a great way to see how all four of those pieces fit together. You can't just have one or two. They're all connected. You absolutely need skilled people using technology and capital to turn natural resources into a booming industrialized economy. It's that magic combination of all four that really, truly fuels that growth. Okay, so we've covered the definitions, we've done the head-to-head comparison, and we've looked at the engine of growth. So, what's the big picture here? Let's boil this all down to the most important takeaways.
All right, here are the three big things to walk away with. First, these labels, developed and developing, they aren't just random. They're based on real, hard economic data, things like GDP and the overall standard of living. Second, the difference between them is massive, and it affects everything from how much money you make to how long you live. And third, the path forward, the way to close that gap, really depends on a country's ability to harness those four key resources we talked about: natural, human, capital, and technology.
And that leads us with a final, pretty big question to think about. We live in a world where technology is just changing everything so fast. Global economies are shifting. New powerhouses are emerging. So will these two simple labels, developed and developing, even make sense in the future? Are they still going to be the best way to understand our world? It's definitely something to think about.